Hi, my name is Nir Eyal, and I'm the author of Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products. Now, in this course, we're going to learn how to make your product or service more engaging. This is one of the key aspects of business today, is that we have to figure out how do we get people to keep coming back to use our product without spending money on expensive advertising and spammy and annoying marketing messages. How do we get people to come back on their own? And so the key question I was really interested in was, how do these world-changing companies like Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp and Slack and Snapchat, what is it about these companies that makes them so habit-forming? So what I want to do is to try and teach you how to learn from the patterns endemic to these habit-forming products. So we're going to look at all these companies that build these very habit-forming products and services and try and learn from the best in the business. Now, this course is not for the Googles and the Facebooks of the world. This course is for you, the entrepreneur, the business owner, the person who's trying to start their own world-changing company, but needs to figure out what are the secrets, the tenets, the psychology behind how to use habits for good. So let me start by telling you a little bit about my background. So I spent many years in the advertising and gaming industry, and I've started and sold 2 tech companies. At my last company, I realized that there was a psychology behind why certain products succeeded and others failed. And so I spent many years doing the research that you find in this book, Hooked, and that we're going to discuss today, all around the deeper psychology of why people do the things they do. We all know that we can listen to what customers will tell us they want, but it turns out there's all sorts of inarticulatable needs, things that customers do that they won't even tell you why they do them. The rule for designing great products and services is not to watch people's mouths, but to watch their feet. And so what I want to help you do is to try and understand how people behave in ways that they might not even understand themselves. So we're going to dive into a lot of deeper psychology around customer behavior, around why people do the things they do, to really understand how to build the kind of products and services that your customer will want to come back to again and again and again. Now, a little bit more about my background from what I first did at my 2 tech companies. I took some time off after my last company was acquired, and I really dove into the research behind some of the companies that I so admired out there, the Facebooks and Twitters and WhatsApps and Googles of the world. And I spent a lot of time speaking to the people who helped build these products, as well as leading psychologists and researchers from across the field to try and distill down the most actionable research that you can use for your product or service. So then my research I published on my blog, nirandfar.com, and then I turned that work into a course that I taught for many years at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, and then most recently the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design at Stanford. So first we're going to look at what is required to change a customer habit. What do we actually need to put into our product or service in order to make our product engaging? So why are we here? Why are we discussing the importance of building habit-forming products? I believe that we can use the psychology of designing for habits to improve people's lives. I'm not here to teach you how to build the next addictive video game or some other frivolity. I know that you have a product or service that you're working on that would improve people's lives if they would only use the product. I've built products and services myself, and I know how hard it is to change people's behaviors. And you know as well. So what we want to do today is to dive into the deeper psychology. What does it take to get people to form a new consumer habit? Well, it turns out we only need 2 things. The 2 things we need to change a consumer habit is, number 1, frequency. There's a great study out there that was done a few years ago at Oxford that found that people who change a habit of flossing their teeth are the ones that did that behavior most often. And of course, we see that in the products and services we use. The more often we use a product or service, the more likely it is to change our habits. So, for example, when we think about our smartphones and the fact that people check their home screens 150 times a day on average, that means that we have a very high propensity, a high likelihood of changing a habit because the behavior occurs with such frequency. Now, the data shows us that if your customer behavior, if the thing that you want your user to do with little or no conscious thought as part of a habit does not occur within a week's time or less, it is very hard to change that consumer habit. So that's the first criteria, is that the behavior has to occur with sufficient frequency. The behavior has to occur within a week's time or less. The more frequently the behavior occurs, the more likely it is to become a habit. Now, the second thing that we need to change a customer habit is an attitude change. An attitude change. What does that mean? Well, in that same study I just mentioned about getting people to floss their teeth, the people who changed their perception of the behavior, the people who went from thinking to themselves, you know what, I don't need to floss my teeth, that's what my dentist does for me every 6 months. The people who went from that point of view to then thinking to themselves, you know what, I have to floss my teeth. It's just something I do. I have to do it. It feels strange not to do it. If you had that perceptual shift, if you changed your mind around that behavior, you were the kind of person who would sustain that behavior 6, 12, 24 months into the study. So how do we do that? How do we change consumer attitudes? Well, let me tell you how companies used to do it, and many of them still do it today. The way most companies will change consumer perception is by using the psychological phenomenon of the mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect says that you are more likely to perceive something as positive, to have an affinity for something, the more often you see it. Well, how do companies do that? They do that through advertising, right? You see these mass media ads of television commercials and billboards and radio spots telling you about a certain product or showing you more often a logo again and again and again. And so the more often you see Coca-Cola or Geico or Exxon or whatever that logo might be, you actually have a greater affinity for that brand. Here's the problem. People like you watching this video, starting new companies, starting new world-changing services when they're just small fry in a big pond, we don't have the kind of money to buy those kind of advertising. And furthermore, let me ask you this. When was the last time you saw that Super Bowl ad for Slack, or that television commercial for Facebook, or that billboard for Twitter? Almost never. I mean, as a proportion of these companies' market capitalization, they spend almost nothing on mass market advertising. Why is that? That's kind of a new phenomenon, right? They spend almost nothing on ads. Well, the fact is that these world-changing companies that are so amazingly good at changing consumer habits don't use the mere exposure effect. What they are doing, and what I'm going to teach you today, is how to build an experience that changes consumer habits. That's what's so special about these new technologies, is that it's not advertising. It's not that we have to spend a lot of money on the mere exposure effect. It's that if we build products and services properly, we can use the experience itself to change people's perceptions. So you can see this, for example, I had a friend a few years ago when Twitter first came out into the market. And we sat down for lunch together, and he spent 5-10 minutes telling me about how stupid Twitter was and how nobody would ever use it and the company's never going to achieve anything. And today, that same guy is on Twitter all the time. He's constantly checking, constantly posting to Twitter. In his case, he had a perceptual shift, right? He saw the product differently than he did previously. So today, I'm going to teach you how do we do that? How do we change a consumer's preferences through the product experience itself? Now, before we dive into the mechanics of actually how do we do that, I want to talk for just a second about why habits matter for the bottom line. Why does this even matter? Why should you spend your time watching this course and reading the book Hooked for your business? What could you tell to your colleagues and your boss about why it's so important to focus on habits? Well, first and foremost, habits increase customer lifetime value. That each user, each customer is worth more the longer they engage with our product or service. So whether it's a SaaS business or an advertising model, whatever it might be, the longer someone engages with our product or service, the more valuable each user becomes to the company. Next, habits give us greater pricing flexibility. So when people form a habit with a product or service, when they form a routine around using a product or service, they're less likely to stop buying the product because of a small fluctuation in price. So think about some of the most habit-forming products out there. For example, consider Starbucks. Starbucks raised its prices a few months ago, a few nickel, a dime here and there, and virtually nobody noticed, right? People didn't stop buying their Frappuccino, mocha latte, whatever that they buy every day because it's part of their daily routine, part of their habits. So small fluctuations in price didn't really matter to them. And of course, that increase in price goes straight to the bottom line. Next, habits supercharge growth. When you think about what everybody wants these days in business, they want their product to go viral, right? They want that hockey stick growth chart, that exponential growth of people telling other people about the product or service and then growing usage of that product. But here's the thing. There's a myth that virality is enough. Getting your product to go viral ain't good enough. And why do I say that? Because what's more important than a product going viral, meaning that one person tells another person about the product or service, is that occurs quickly. It's called a viral cycle time. Viral cycle time is the amount of time that elapses between one person telling more than one person about the product or service. And if that doesn't occur frequently, if people aren't telling others about your product every day, then you're never going to get that viral growth chart. You're never going to get that exponential hockey stick growth. Why? Because customers are also churning out. So to escape that, to have that kind of viral growth, what you really have to do is to build the kind of product that is used habitually, that is used frequently enough so that other people tell others about that product. Now, finally, and perhaps the most important aspect of why habits are so important for the bottom line is that habits increase defensibility. It is very difficult for the competition to swoop in and take your customer away once someone has formed a habit with your product or service. You know, when I do live workshops and seminars, I like to ask a question of the audience. And I ask people to raise their hands if they have searched with Google in the past 24 hours. And almost everybody's hand goes up in the room. And then I ask, who here has searched with Bing, the second most popular search engine in the world? Who here has searched with Bing? And there's almost no hands up in the room. Now, you would think it's because Google is just such a superior product, right? That those geniuses in Mountain View, California have just built a product that's so much better, right? Wrong. It turns out in third-party studies, when people look at Google versus Bing, when they look at the search results, but they don't know whose search engine is which, and they strip out the branding, it's a 50-50 preference split. And yet, despite the fact that people can hardly tell the difference between the two, why does Google own 80 to 90% of market share for search? Because when people form a habit around a product, they don't even consider the competition. Which brings me to this cold, hard conclusion, that it is a lie that the best product wins. I know you've been taught that if you just build the most technologically advanced solution, if your product is just better than everybody else's, that consumers will beat a path to your door. And I'm here to tell you that that's not necessarily true. That Silicon Valley graveyards are full of companies that had the best technology, but it's not the best technology that necessarily wins. It's the technology that captures the monopoly of the mind, the thing that we turn to first, just as we Google something, without asking ourselves, gee, I wonder what the best search engine is out there. No, we just Google it with little or no conscious thought, out of habit. And so what I want to teach you for the rest of this course and in my book is how do we build the kind of products that people turn to with little or no conscious thought, purely out of habit, so that we can change their lives for good, so that we can help them build the kind of habits in their lives to help them live happier, healthier, more productive, more connected lives. So for the rest of the workshop, we're going to talk about how do we build your hook? How do we design an experience designed to connect the user's problem to your product with enough frequency to form a habit? That's what a hook is all about. Now, these hooks we find are endemic to all sorts of habit-forming products, from Facebook to Twitter to Instagram to WhatsApp to even online products that we find to be things that we engage with on a habitual or daily basis. So we're going to start building this hook for your product or service through the rest of the workshop. Now, let's talk about what a hook is. What are the 4 parts that you need to build into a consumer experience to make it habit-forming? Every hook starts with a trigger, to an action, to a reward, and finally an investment. So we're going to dive right in to start building the first part of your hook, the trigger phase. Now, triggers are things that prompt us to action. They tell us what to do next. And there are two types of triggers. The first type of trigger you'll be very familiar with. These are called external triggers. External triggers are things that tell the user what to do next with some piece of information. Click here, buy now, play this. Even in the physical world, a friend telling you about this great new app you should try out, all examples of external triggers. Now, we see this in our outside world every single day. We see these all around us as business owners, as product designers. We build these external triggers to get people to take action by giving them some piece of information. But what turns out to be actually even more important than the external triggers, when it comes to building a long-term habit at least, is designing what's called an internal trigger. Internal triggers are things that tell us what to do next, but where the information for what to do is stored as a memory or an association inside the user's brain. So what we do when we're in a particular place, a certain situation, partaking in a particular routine, and most frequently when we experience certain emotions, prompts us to action, prompts us to take behaviors, to take these habits with little or no conscious thought. Now, the most frequently occurring internal triggers are these emotions, but not just any emotion. Turns out they are specifically negative emotions. Negative emotions. So what we do when we're feeling bored or lonely or indecisive or fatigued or lost, what we do when we feel this way prompts us to action. So this is a very important lesson. Let me tell you, there is only one reason, and one reason only, that you use any product or service. And that one reason is to modulate our mood, to feel something different. That's why we use all products or services, right? When we feel the internal trigger of hunger, we eat something. When we feel the internal trigger of feeling cold, we put on a coat. And when we feel the internal trigger of loneliness, well, we might check Facebook. When we feel the internal trigger of uncertainty, we Google it. And when we feel the internal trigger of boredom, well, there's plenty of services to satisfy that itch. We go on YouTube, we check Reddit, we look at stock prices, sports scores, the news. All of these products and services cater to these internal triggers. So it's absolutely critical, if you want to build the kind of product or service that people come back to on their own, time and time again, habitually, you have got to identify what is your internal trigger that occurs with sufficient frequency. Remember in the last section we talked about how important it is for the behavior to occur within a week's time or less. What you've got to do is to understand what is that internal trigger, what's the itch that you're going to satisfy, that you're going to scratch for your user. Until you can identify what is that internal trigger, you're basically getting lucky if you succeed by building that habit. It's much smarter to understand what that internal trigger is and go and capture it. Try and link to that internal trigger with your product's use. So the ultimate goal of a habit-forming product is to build a mental association with that internal trigger. Like we talked about earlier, when I'm seeking connection, when I'm feeling lonely, maybe I check Facebook. When I'm uncertain, I Google. When I'm bored, I check YouTube. Your product's goal to build a healthy habit should be, what is the user feeling in that moment in time, and how am I going to attach my product's use to that internal trigger? So in the workbook you're going to see later, I want you to actually start thinking about what's the internal trigger that occurs with sufficient frequency in your user's life that you're going to attach your product's use to. Now, that's the ultimate goal of a habit-forming product. That's the holy grail, is to attach to that internal trigger. Now, a question I oftentimes hear is, why does it have to be a negative emotion? Why does it have to be why can't it be happiness or joy? Well, it's a bit of semantics, but if you think about it, it's both, it's two sides of a coin. That if there's no problem, if there's no pain point, then the customer doesn't need anything from us. We should leave them alone. So it's very imperative that you figure out what is that pain point, what's the itch that you're going to scratch for your user. So it's not that people feel joy and that's why they check Facebook and that's why they share things. It's that they have a need. They have a need for social connection. And that need feels uncomfortable. It's not that it's painful, it's not like a gash in your arm, but it's an emotional need that they have, and that's where we want our product and service to provide relief for that discomfort, to serve their needs. And of course, there are all sorts of ways that we can use these internal triggers to help people live better lives. So I've worked with financial services companies that help people save money. Well, they pinpointed the internal trigger of fear of not having enough savings to buy the thing you want to buy. So is that an itch that occurs frequently? Of course it is. People are constantly wondering, ooh, do I have enough money in my checking account or my savings account to buy the thing I want to buy? Well, how could you make that easier, right? How could you build a product or service to help them habitually check an app, check a website, check a site, whatever it might be, to satiate that discomfort? So it's absolutely critical that you figure out what that internal trigger actually is. Now, what do we do after we figured out that internal trigger that we're going to attach to? To get to that promised land, to build the kind of product or service that is going to provide people with relief habitually on a frequent enough basis, we've got to first start with external triggers. Now remember, external triggers are these things that prompt us to action with some piece of information, some kind of prompt. So think about notifications and emails and pings and dings and rings and all the things that we see on our devices that prompt us to action, that tell us what to do next. Now, many of these things can be pretty annoying, and I often hear the question of, how do I make sure that I send people these external triggers without spamming them, without making them feel annoyed by these messages? And that's a terrific question. And the answer is not so clear. Many people are not quite sure what the answer is, and maybe they feel bad about sending these external triggers. Maybe they're not sure how frequently to send them. They don't want to inundate people. The answer is not how much. It's the quality of these external triggers. There's one word that separates an external trigger, a message, a notification that feels like spam, and a notification that feels like magic. And that one word is context. Context. That the closer together you can couple the external trigger, the notification, the message, the prompt to action, with the internal trigger, the moment in time the user feels that itch, the closer together you can bring those two things together so that the minute the user feels the internal trigger, that's when they get the external trigger, the more likely the user is to respond to that notification. So, many times app makers, product makers, they send people external triggers on their schedule instead of the customer's schedule. Let me tell you a quick story that illustrates the point. I was on a flight recently across the country, and I was sitting in the aisle seat. And across from me, in the other aisle, was a gentleman who was asleep. Right? He had his blanket tucked up to his chin, and he had a big pillow there. It was very clear that he was sleeping. Well, the flight attendant comes along through the aisle, and she looks at the gentleman, and she says, "Sir." And he doesn't wake up. Clearly, he's sleeping. Everybody on the plane knew that the guy was sleeping. So she says it again, a little bit louder. She says, "Sir." And still, he doesn't wake up. And then finally, she says it so that the whole plane hears. She says, "Sir." And he wakes up. He says, "Whoa, what is it?" And she says, "What do you want to drink, sir?" This is a great illustration of how we can bug people. We can prompt people at the wrong time in a way that is not appreciated by the user. Did that guy want a drink? Of course he wants a drink at some point when he was thirsty, not when he was sleeping. So don't send your customers and users external triggers just when you feel like it. Find the moment in time, that internal trigger, when just at that moment, that's when I want the external trigger. Doing so will assure that your external triggers are welcome, they're something that solve a problem for the user, and they're much more likely to be responded upon, so that eventually, from that trigger phase, you can start building out the 4 steps of your hook. So now that we've figured out what our users' internal triggers are, what is their itch that we're hoping to satisfy for them, and we've also prompted them to action with our external triggers, the next step of the hook is called the action phase. The action phase is defined as the simplest behavior the user can do in anticipation of a reward or relief from that internal trigger, from that discomfort. Now, think of a few very simple actions in some habit-forming products that you might use. For example, a scroll on Pinterest, or a quick search on Google, or what could be simpler than just pushing the play button on YouTube? You see how easy those behaviors are, how simple those actions are? Well, it turns out that's how easy we need to make the actions in our products and services. So if you're building a habit-forming product, it is critical that you make it as easy as possible to get relief from that discomfort. Turns out there's actually a formula to help us design these individual behaviors. It comes to us from a researcher I highly respect at Stanford by the name of B.J. Fogg. And Fogg tells us that for any human behavior B, we need three things at the same time. So for any human behavior, we need motivation, we need ability, and we need a trigger. Now, we talked a lot about triggers. Let's talk about motivation and ability. Motivation is the energy for action, how much we want to do a particular behavior. You know, it's impossible to get somebody to do something, at least not ethically get them to do something. We can coerce them, of course, but coercion is unethical. We always want to persuade as opposed to coerce. Persuasion requires that users have at least some level of motivation. None of what I'm teaching you here today is about getting people to do things they don't want to do. That's unethical. What we want to get people to do is things they want to do, that they have some amount of motivation, but for lack of good product design, don't do. So a bit of motivation is always required. Now, there's 6 factors of motivation according to Fogg, and he tells us that all human beings desire to seek pleasure and avoid pain. They seek hope and avoid fear. They seek social acceptance and they avoid social rejection. So if you look at every commercial you've ever seen, every billboard, every radio spot, every bit of marketing copy on your website or app, fundamentally has to cater to one or more of these 6 human motivators of seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, seeking hope, avoiding fear, seeking social acceptance, avoiding social rejection. So these are these 6 levers that we can pull on to boost user motivation to do a particular behavior. The next thing that we want to look at in the formula B equals MAT is the A, which stands for ability. Ability is how easy or difficult a particular behavior is to do. And what we know from decades and decades of psychology research, and of course common sense, is that the easier something is to do, the more likely people are to do it. And so here again we have 6 key levers, 6 things that we can pull on to make a behavior more likely to occur by making it easier to do. The first is time. If we can save our customer or users time, they become more likely to do that key behavior. So time is a limited resource that if people don't have enough time at their disposal in that moment, they can't do that key behavior. So think about maybe when you wanted to go grocery shopping, but you don't have enough time in your day, so you skip it and you do it another day. So this translates to our products as well. If you can make a behavior easier to do by making it something that the user can accomplish more quickly, they are more likely to take that behavior. Next is money. The cheaper something is, the more likely people are to buy or to do that behavior based off there's some kind of barrier of cost. So money as well is a limited resource for people, and so the cheaper something is, the more likely people are to do that behavior or to buy that product. Next is physical effort. The harder something is to do physically, the less likely people are to do it. So if a particular behavior requires a lot of physical effort, if you have to go run up some stairs, for example, to do the thing that you wanted to do, you're more or less likely to do it based on how easy or difficult the task is to do. Next is brain cycles, and this is the big one, right? When it comes to products built online today, when it comes to apps or websites or any kind of interactive experience, brain cycles are incredibly important because the harder something is to understand, the more difficult it is for me to understand what it is you want me to do with your app, with your website, whatever it might be, the less likely I am to do it. So the rule here is that we want to design experiences that are extremely easy to understand for the user, because the easier something is to understand, the more likely I am to do that behavior. Next comes social deviance. Now, social deviance says that we become more likely to do something when we see other people like us doing it, right? It's called social proof. I become more likely to do it when I see what others are doing. And then finally, non-routine. Now, non-routine says that we become more likely to do something simply for the fact that we have done it before in the past. So the more we do a particular behavior, the easier it becomes, the more likely we are to do it in the future. So what do we call that? That's called practice. The more we do something, the easier it becomes, the more likely we are to do it again in the future. So if you think about how you might design a product for someone who's very tech literate versus someone who's not very tech literate, well, the fact that someone who has a lot of experience with a technology finds it easier to use is a testament to how they have practiced with that interface. So this is really important. Habits have this repeater effect that the more you can get people to engage with a product or service, the more likely they are to continue to engage with it. So what we want to do is to plot out motivation and ability to understand where our user is lacking a particular resource. Are they short on motivation? Are they short on ability because the task is too hard to do? And then finally, is the trigger present? So let's make this concrete with an example. Consider why you may not pick up a call. Let's say a phone rings, your cell phone rings, and you don't pick up the call. What are 3 reasons why you may not pick up the call? Number 1, you have a lack of motivation. So maybe you see who the caller is and it's someone you don't want to talk to, a telemarketer or someone you don't want to hear from right now. You lack motivation. Next, think about what happens if you lack ability. Well, let's say the phone rings, you hear it ring, you really wanted to pick up the call, but you're in the shower right now, and you hear the phone ringing across the room, and to get out of the shower would be very difficult. You lack ability to go pick up the call. You'd have to dry yourself off, get out of the shower, maybe make your bathroom all wet trying to rush to the phone, so you say, forget it, I'll get it another time, because you lacked ability. And then finally, consider what happens if you don't have a trigger. So imagine when you really want to pick up that call, the phone is right there next to you, very easy to pick up the call, you have plenty of ability, but what happens if you don't hear the phone ring? There's no trigger present. Maybe the phone is on silent. So even if you have motivation ability, if you don't have that trigger, the behavior does not occur. So the point here is that for any human behavior, anything that you want your customer or user to do, every click, every purchase, every action that you want the user to take, you have to have sufficient motivation, ability, and a trigger every single time. Now, the first step, as we talked about in the last section, was to make sure that you have a clear trigger present. I can't tell you how many companies I work with, and we get together for this big, expensive design review, and I look at the user experience, and there's no clear trigger present. The user doesn't know what you want them to do. So that's the very first step. After we do the trigger, now we have to make sure the behavior is as easy as possible to do. And this is where you're going to get much more bang for the buck than try and boost motivation. A lot of people think, well, let's tell customers what they need to do, or we'll convince customers that our product is super great, and we'll show them more testimonials and more videos and more text on our website. And you know what? That tends not to work. And it doesn't work because motivation is very difficult to move. You're going to get much more bang for your buck if you simply design an easier-to-use consumer experience. I want you to push that ability curve as far as you possibly can. Think of all the points of friction, all the things that might prevent your user from doing the thing that they themselves want to do because it's too difficult. Time, money, physical effort, brain cycles, non-routine, social deviance. What's in their way? And I want you to remove as many steps as possible to make the action phase of your hook as easy as possible to do. Doing so will make it much more likely that people will pass through the 4 steps of your hook on their way to becoming habituated to your product. So now that we've figured out the internal trigger that's going to prompt your user to action, we figured out the external trigger that gives them some piece of information to take the key action you want them to take, then we figured out in the action phase of the hook how to make the behavior as easy as possible to do. Now it's time to give people what they came for. Now it's time to scratch their itch in the 3rd step of the hook, the reward phase. The reward phase is all about scratching that itch, giving people what they want. And remember, we can only know what they want when we've identified that internal trigger. So don't skip that step. Make sure the most important thing you have to answer is what's the itch that your product is going to address? What's the habit that you want to create? What's the thing that you want people to do day to day with little or no conscious thought, that healthy habit that you're going to create in your users' lives? And now it's time for the reward itself, for the place where the itch itself is scratched. Now, when we talk about rewards, we have to take a little detour into the brain, and particularly an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. Now, the nucleus accumbens was first studied by two Canadian researchers by the name of Olds and Milner, and they discovered that this area of the brain had some very interesting qualities. In particular, what they did was to connect a lab animal's nucleus accumbens to a tiny electrode. And every time this lab animal would press on a little button, a little lever, they would get an electrical jolt to this part of the brain. And what Olds and Milner found in their studies is that these lab animals wanted nothing but stimulating their nucleus accumbens again and again and again. They would run across painful electrified grids. They would forgo food and water just to continue to activate their nucleus accumbens. Now, in later experiments done on people, when people were given a little button to press on, and every time they pressed on this button, they received an electrical jolt to their nucleus accumbens, they observed similar results. That some people in these studies had to have the machines forcibly removed from them to get them to stop pressing on these buttons. Well, it turns out that we don't need electrodes in people's brains to get them to push buttons, because your nucleus accumbens and your customer's nucleus accumbens is activated every single day with things like junk food and sex and certain chemicals and, of course, our technologies. All of these things activate the very same reward centers of our brain. Now, for decades, the psychology community believed that the nucleus accumbens, the purpose of the nucleus accumbens, was to stimulate pleasure. Which, if you think about it, makes sense, right? Why would lab animals and later people incessantly activate this part of the brain if it wasn't because it felt good, right? Not exactly. What we now know about the nucleus accumbens that Olds and Milner never did is that the way the nucleus accumbens stimulates us to action is by creating what we call the stress of desire, this wanting, this craving reflex. Because what we now know is that the nucleus accumbens becomes most active in anticipation of a reward. But when we actually get the thing we want, the thing that's going to make us feel good and finally make us happy, that's when the nucleus accumbens becomes less active. So it's really all about anticipation of pleasure, that pain, that discomfort of wanting, not the pleasure itself. And it turns out that there is a way to supercharge this reaction. Did you know that there is a way that I can teach you to manufacture desire? Do you want to know how? Are you curious? I'm doing it to you right now. So when I took that long pause and I shifted forward and I asked you a question, you perked up a bit. What am I going to say next? What's going to happen? Why did this guy stop talking? What I did just now is to insert a bit of variability, a bit of uncertainty, a bit of mystery. And it turns out that that element causes us to engage, it causes us to focus, and it is highly habit-forming. It's called a variable reward. And we see it in all sorts of things that we find most engaging, most habit-forming, all sorts of products that capture your attention and won't let go. You will find these variable rewards. Now, the research around variable rewards comes to us from B.F. Skinner, a psychologist back in the 1950s and 60s, who studied what happened when he gave his lab animals a reward on an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. So here's what happened. Skinner had these food pellets, and he would give a little food pellet to his pigeons every time they pecked at this disc. So peck at the disc, get a reward. So very quickly, Skinner could train his pigeons to peck at the disc whenever they were hungry. Mind you, if the pigeons weren't hungry, they didn't peck at the disc. Why? You know why, because there was no internal trigger. But if the internal trigger of hunger was present, the pigeons would peck at the disc. He could train the pigeons to peck at the disc whenever they were hungry. That's called operant conditioning. Terrific. But then Skinner started to run out of these food pellets. He literally didn't have enough of them, and so he started giving out the food pellets just every once in a while. So sometimes the pigeon would peck at the disc, no food pellet would come out. The next time the pigeon would peck at the disc, they would receive a reward. And here's what Skinner observed, that the rate of response, the number of times that these pigeons pecked at the disc, increased. The frequency occurred more often when the reward was given on an intermittent schedule of reinforcement. Why does this happen? Because variability spikes activity in the nucleus accumbens, creating this desirous response, this wanting reflex. And of course, what worked on pigeons and rats for B.F. Skinner also works on us. And so in all sorts of products and services that you find most engaging, most habit-forming, you will find these variable rewards. And we can split these variable rewards into 3 categories. What I call rewards of the tribe, rewards of the hunt, and rewards of the self. Let me introduce these to you briefly. Rewards of the tribe are things that feel good, that have this element of variability, and come from other people. So when you think about empathetic joy, feeling good because someone else feels good, like for example, when you tell someone a joke and you can't wait to see if they got the joke, right? That would be a form of a variable reward, a reward of the tribe. Also competition, cooperation. All of these things are rewards of the tribe, things that feel good, that have this element of variability and come from other people. If you think about products and services that utilize rewards of the tribe, of course, the best example online is social media. So when you check your Facebook app, you're never quite sure what you're going to find. What photos do people post? What videos might you see? What are the comments going to say? How many likes does something get? High degree of variability when it comes to a product like Facebook. The next type of variable reward is rewards of the hunt. Rewards of the hunt stem from our primal search for food and other material possessions, and in modern society we buy these things with money. So when many people think of variable rewards, they often think about slot machines. They think about Las Vegas gambling casinos, right? Where the variable reward is what we might win when we play one of these games of chance. Interestingly enough, we see the exact same psychology at work online. So for example, consider the feed. When you check Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook or any number of other products, have you noticed how there's just a feed in everything these days? What is it about the feed? Well, let's say you check LinkedIn, for example. LinkedIn has become this content site where people post all this interesting information about their industry or their businesses. And if you check the first story on the top of your feed, maybe it's not that interesting, and a second might not be that interesting, but maybe the third or fourth is interesting. And so what do you have to do to see more interesting content? What do you have to do to keep seeing interesting variable rewards? All you have to do is scroll. And that scrolling uses the exact same psychology as pulling on a slot machine. Both variable rewards of the hunt, searching and searching for more interesting content and information. Finally, the last type of variable reward is what is called the rewards of the self. Now, rewards of the self are things that feel good, that have this element of variability, but don't come from other people and aren't about the search for information or monetary rewards. These are things that are intrinsically pleasurable. They feel good in and of themselves. So it's all about the search for mastery, consistency, competency, and control. Best example I can think of is, of course, gaming. Right? So when you play Angry Birds or Clash of Clans or any number of these other games that you might play on your phone or online, many of them don't involve other people. You're playing them on your own, so it's not rewards of the tribe. Many of them, you're not even winning anything in terms of material possessions, right? Maybe you're getting points, but you can't really do anything with those points. But there's something fun about getting to the next level, the next accomplishment, the next achievement. Now, even if you are not a gamer yourself, I bet you play one game every single day, and that game is email. Email uses the exact same mechanics of rewards of the self. Checking those unread messages, finishing the to-dos in your to-do list, or the thing that always gets me is that one app notification on my home screen that I just have to open to clear it away. Those are all examples of rewards of the self. Search for mastery, consistency, competency, and control. Now, what's important here is that you don't have to utilize all 3 types of variable rewards. That's not a requirement. The requirement is that you have at least one. Now, something that is very important to know as well is that not every product would want to insert variability into the product experience. Clearly, if you think about a product like Google or Uber, for example, they wouldn't want to insert variability because that doesn't make much sense for the product. But the variability is still there. Think about it. These products operate in an inherently variable situation. And in those cases where the variability already exists, your job as the product maker is to give the user greater agency and control. Let me show you what I mean. Remember back in the days when you used to order a taxi cab by calling up a dispatcher, right? You look up the number, you call the taxi cab company, and you'd say, please pick me up at this particular location. They'd say, great. You'd say, how long until I meet the cab? And the dispatcher would always tell you, 15 minutes. They, of course, had no clue, but there was an easy number they could give you. Maybe it was 30 minutes, maybe it was 45, who knows? Think about what that did to your stress level, to your internal trigger of worry, whether you can get to where you're going on time, right? You'd have to sit there on the corner and just wait. Well, here comes Uber and Lyft, and instead of just waiting there on the corner and wondering when your ride's going to get there, and your fear and your anxiety, your internal trigger of can I get to where I'm going on time, doing nothing with it, Uber and Lyft gives you this beautiful Pac-Man-like interface that tells you exactly how far away your ride is and when you're scheduled to arrive. What does that do to the user's agency and control in that inherently variable situation? It gives them greater comfort. Their itch is scratched. So the lesson here is that for some products and services, for example, if the internal trigger is boredom, well, then you want to insert variability to entertain people. If the internal trigger is loneliness, seeking connection, well, then your variable reward must connect people together. The point of the variable reward phase of the hook is to give people what they want, to scratch the user's itch, and yet add a bit of mystery around what they might find the next time they engage with the product, or to give them greater agency and control over something that is inherently a variable situation. All right, welcome back. You have made it through the first 3 steps of the hook: the trigger, the action, the reward, and finally, the 4th critical step of the hook, the investment phase. The investment phase is probably the most overlooked of the 4 steps of the hook because people think, hey, you know what, if I just give people what they want, that's enough. That's all I need to do. It's not all you need to do. And if you're building a habit-forming product, it is absolutely critical that you find ways to get people to invest. When many people think of the word investment, they think about money, and money is one form of investment, but it's not the only form. And in fact, it's not the most important form. A lot of companies I work with are in the e-commerce space, and they're very concerned about how do we get people to check out. It's about how do I get people to buy whatever's in their cart. And I'm here to tell you that it's not just about getting people to check out. It's also finding ways to get them to check in. Because monetization in this day and age is a result of engagement, not the other way around. The investment phase is about having your user put something into the product in anticipation of a future benefit, some kind of future reward. Remember, the action phase is about immediate gratification. That's not what the investment phase is about. The investment phase is something the user does for a future benefit, and it can take many forms. Now, the reason the investment phase is so important is that it increases the likelihood of the next pass through the hook. And the investment phase does this in 2 critical ways. The first way that the investment phase increases the likelihood of the next pass through the hook is by loading the next trigger. Loading the next trigger is something that the user does to bring themselves back. Let me give you an example. When you send someone a message on Slack or WhatsApp or any number of other messaging services, you're not necessarily getting any kind of immediate reward, right? There's no points, there's no badges, no leaderboards. Nothing really happens when you send someone that message. What you're doing by investing in that platform and sending that message is that you're likely to get, at some point, a reply. And that reply, when you get it on your cell phone, comes with an app notification in the form of an external trigger. And that external trigger prompts you through the hook once again. So this critically important aspect of the investment phase of having your user do something that brings themselves back, not some piece of spammy marketing or advertising that you send me, but something that I asked for because of what I did the last time I interacted with the product or service. So that's a critical question. What can you do to load the next trigger for your user every time they interact with your product or service? This can be both online and offline, right? Let's say if a customer comes to your place of business and maybe they fill out a little piece of paper form that then they're going to be sent in the mail. For example, when I go to the dentist, before I leave, they have me fill out this piece of paper, and I'm loading the next trigger to tell me when it's time to book my next appointment. Of course, online, this is much faster and easier and cheaper to do. So don't neglect those opportunities to find ways to get your user to load the next trigger every time they interact with your product experience. Now, the second way that investments increase the likelihood of the next pass through the hook is by storing value. This might be the most important thing you hear through this entire course, is this fact that habit-forming products can increase in value with use. Now think about that. That's amazing. Unlike physical goods, right? Things in the physical world, everything that is made out of atoms as opposed to bits. Think about this couch or my clothing or your desk or chair, whatever. Everything in the physical world loses value with wear and tear. It depreciates with use. But habit-forming products can do the opposite. They can appreciate. They can get better and better the more we interact with them. For example, the more content I upload to my Google Drive or Dropbox, for example, the better it becomes as my one and only cloud storage solution. Another form of investment is data. The more data I give to a company, for example, Mint.com or Pinterest or Facebook, the more data you give these companies, you are building the product in real time based on the data you give these companies. Every time you like something or friend something or upload something, you're giving the company data to tailor the site to your interests and tastes based on the information you give them. So if you were to log into my Pinterest account, for example, or my Facebook account, it actually wouldn't be very interesting for you because it's all been tailored based on my investment of data that I've given to these companies. The next form of investment is followers. So the more followers someone has, for example, on a platform like Twitter, the better the platform becomes a way to reach their audience. So if tomorrow Twitter were to say, hey, look, you're going to have to start paying for Twitter now. It's no longer free. Who's more likely to pay Twitter? Is it going to be someone with 10 followers or 10,000 followers? Of course, it's going to be the person with 10,000 followers because they've invested so much more in their platform in the form of their follower count. And the last form of investment is reputation. Now, my reputation on sites like Airbnb or Upwork or eBay dictate what I can charge for my goods and services. Now, think about that. That's a form of reputation, a form of investment that users can literally take to the bank. I can charge more if I have a good reputation on one of these platforms. And how likely am I to leave one of these platforms, even if a better product or service comes along, if I've stored all this value in the form of my reputation? It's kind of hard to do, right? It's kind of hard to leave. Which gets back to that cold hard fact that I told you at the beginning of this course, that it's not always the best product that wins. There have been many, many competitors to eBay and Airbnb and Upwork that have not been able to capture market share because it's very hard to leave one of these platforms after you've stored value in the form of your reputation. I want to leave you with a quick anecdote to illustrate the point about why investments are so important. Let's say that you were to get together with one of your friends and you sit down for lunch together and you decide to, share what friends tend to share about. You talk about your family life, you talk about your work life, you talk about your struggles, your hardships, what you're going through, and you kind of bare your soul a little bit and you build a relationship with your friend over this nice lunch you've just had. You part ways, and then a few weeks later, you decide to get together again. Now, what would happen if you sat down with your friend and you quickly realize that they don't remember a thing you just told them? Nothing. Either your friend has amnesia and needs help, or they're not going to stay your friend for very long. And of course, we in the business world do this to our customers all the time. Our customers want us to improve our services based on the information about them that they're offering us. So if you're not making the product better with use, if you're not using these forms of investment to improve the product, to make it better and better with use, you're leaving a huge opportunity on the table. So the fourth and very critical step of the hook is to find ways to get users to invest in your product and service, to load the next trigger, and to store value with use. Doing so puts you well on your way to building a habit-forming product. So today we've covered the 5 critical questions that you've got to ask yourself if you're building a habit-forming product. Number 1, what's the internal trigger that your product is addressing? Number 2, what's the external trigger that prompts the user to action? Number 3, what is the key action that you want users to take and how can it be made simpler? Number 4, how do we scratch the user's itch and yet leave them wanting more? And then finally, what's the investment? What's the bit of work the user does to increase the likelihood to the next pass through the hook? Now, it's through successive cycles through these hooks This is how customer preferences are shaped. If we can do it with sufficient frequency, this is how our tastes are formed and how these habits take hold. Now, that was a very quick overview of the Hook model and of what you'll find in Hooked. What I recommend, however, that there's a lot more in the book that we didn't have time to cover today. There are also exercises in the book as well to help you on your way to building a habit-forming product. So I really hope you'll check out the book and do some of those exercises to fill out the rest of your knowledge around how to build habit-forming products. But before we close here, there's one more topic I'd like to address, and that is the morality of manipulation. You know, in this day and age, there's a lot of talk about how products can change our behavior. And I want you to know that what you've learned today brings new responsibility to your career. That how you utilize the information you've learned is of critical importance. Because let's face it, anytime we are changing people's behavior, we are persuading them to do something in their interest and yet in ours as well, particularly for a commercial interest, that is a form of manipulation. And so we need to be very careful about how we apply these techniques. As I mentioned in the beginning of the course, this course is not for the Facebook and Google and gaming companies of the world. They already know these techniques. I'm teaching you these techniques because I know that you can use them for good. You can use them to help build healthy habits in people's lives, to help them live happier, healthier, more connected, more productive lives. So I want to show you just a few examples of how products can do this. I want to tell you about one particular company that I've worked with called 7 Cups. Now, 7 Cups was started by a psychotherapist by the name of Glenn Moriarty, who called me a few years ago, as you can call me. Check out my website, nirandfar.com, and you can book a 15-minute office hour with me for free. Glenn Moriarty called me a few years ago and said, Nir, look, I read your book, and I built a hook here, and I want to share it with you. And he said, look, I'm a psychotherapist. He's not technical at all. And he said, I know that a lot of people out there can't get the therapy they need because it's too difficult. He read the chapter around the action phase of the hook, and he realized how making something hard to do makes it less likely that people will do it. And so he told me how people don't get therapy because it's time-consuming, it's expensive, there's a lot of reputational risk, a lot of fear, a lot of brain cycles about how do I find the right person. So he built this simple app with a wonderful hook I'd like to share with you. The internal trigger is when someone feels down. Glenn services veterans with PTSD. He services parents of children with disabilities, or just any one of us who just feels lonely and needs someone to talk to. So the internal trigger is that itch of seeking connection, of loneliness, of wanting someone to talk to. The action phase of the hook is to simply pick up your phone, press one button, and you're instantly connected to another human being on that app for free. The variable reward is rewards of the tribe. You've got another person there who's ready and willing to help you. And finally, the investment phase. And this is where it gets really interesting. The investment phase for 7 Cups, for Glenn's hook, was that every time you use 7 Cups, you're offered an opportunity to learn how to be a trained listener yourself. This product has been shown to be as effective as traditional expensive psychotherapy. 7 Cups services over 800,000 sessions a week in over 180 languages. Talk about the amazing power of using habit-forming technology for good. And that's what I want you to do. So I'm going to give you a very quick 2-part test for identifying whether you're using what I just taught you ethically. Now, it doesn't mean that necessarily that you're going to have a successful business if you follow this ethical standard, or that, frankly, you can't succeed financially by not being ethical. But if you care about treating customers right, about acting ethically, which I hope you do, I want to give you this 2-part test. The 2-part test goes like this. The first question I want you to answer when it comes to applying these techniques is, are you working on something that you believe materially improves people's lives? Right? Can you look at yourself in the mirror and say, whatever it is that I'm using these techniques to do, whatever behaviors I'm trying to influence folks to do I believe that I'm materially improving people's lives? If you say no, you don't pass the test. But if you say yes, congratulations. Now move on to the second part of the test, which is to ask yourself this critical question, which is, are you breaking the first rule of drug dealing? I wonder if you know the first rule of drug dealing. The first rule of drug dealing is never get high on your own supply. But I want you to break that rule. So the second question is, am I the user? Am I the user? I believe if you are making a product that you believe materially improves people's lives and you yourself are the user, what you're doing when you're the user is that if there are any deleterious effects to using this product, you yourself will know about it. So by following that two-part standard, that two-part test, you're what I call a facilitator. Not only are you acting ethically, by the way, there might be problems with your product. This doesn't prevent you from making a product with unforeseen consequences. The history of technological innovation is plagued with unforeseen consequences. That's unavoidable. But if there are any negative consequences, you'll be the first to know about it. And second is that doing so gives you a tremendous competitive advantage. It is so hard to build products for somebody else that you don't know well. That's probably the most difficult part about building a successful product or service, is to truly understand the user's needs. Well, there's a huge hack here, which is to build products that you yourself need. When you are the user, you have tremendous insight into that product or service. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't build products for other people. I'm just saying it's much more difficult to do, and sometimes it can border on this ethical line. So by being the kind of product, by building the kind of product or service that you yourself believe in materially improves people's lives and you use, you are casting yourself in the mold of the kind of founders who started Google and Instagram and Facebook and WhatsApp. If you look at across all these gigantic tech companies, all of them were started by people who believed they were materially improving people's lives, and they themselves were the user. And if you follow that standard, I think you're on the right side ethically, and you greatly increase your odds of success. I wish you the best of luck using the techniques I've showed you today to improve people's lives by building healthy habits, and I hope that you will continue to use habits for good.